Vancouver, British Columbia, the beating heart of Canada's westernmost province. Sandwiched between Burrard Inlet and the north arm of the Fraser Delta, between the Pacific Ocean and the Coast Mountains, this coastal metropolis is renowned for its vibrant cultural scene, its ethnic diversity, and its elegant incorporation of natural beauty into its urban landscape. It has played host to some of Canada's most cherished artists, including Haida sculptor Bill Reid and Vancouver Island painter Emily Carr, and has served as the whetstone on which some of Canada's most beloved actors and comedians, from Colin Mochrie to Seth Rogen, honed their craft. Its streets and buildings are regularly used as sets for Hollywood movies, earning it the nickname Hollywood North. Beneath its cosmopolitan charm and urban chaos, the so-called Rain City has an undercurrent of primitive mystery, reflected by the totem poles, panel carvings, and cedar masks that ornament its parks and public areas, striking evocations of its storied past. Long before Spanish explorer José María Narváez first sailed into Burrard Inlet, the local Coast Salish told stories about a frightening human-like monster that haunted the surrounding rainforests. When white frontiersmen began to settle Canada's southwest coast in the early mid-1800s, dispatched by the Hudson's Bay Company or drawn by the lure of gold, this figure of native myth occasionally crossed paths with them. Sightings of this mysterious wild man increased dramatically throughout the 20th century, proportionate with a rapid increase in settlement, and in the number of white men who ventured into the wilderness by dint of recreation or occupational necessity. In this piece, we will explore classic Canadian Sasquatch stories from Vancouver. The Greater Vancouver Area, or Metro Vancouver, stretches from the shores of the Strait of Georgia, up the valley of the Lower Fraser River, to the historic village of Fort Langley, encompassing the western half of British Columbia's lower mainland. This area lies entirely within the ancestral domain of the downriver Halkomelem, a collection of Central Coast Salish tribes united by a common dialect. Vancouver proper, and the Point Grey headland in particular, comprises the traditional home of the Musqueam, a First Nation which took its name from a mysterious grass which once fringed the Fraser River. According to Musqueam tradition, this grass grew from the droppings of a sealkey, an enormous two-headed serpent saturated with preternatural power, in which the natives of Canada's west coast universally believed. Another unusual creature to haunt the mists of Musqueam folklore was the wild man. American anthropologist Wayne P. Suttles expounded on this belief in his article On the Cultural Track of Sasquatch, which appeared in his 1987 anthology entitled Coast Salish Essays. The term Sasquatch, Suttles wrote, is well known at Musqueam as the name for a large, hairy, man-like creature that lives in the woods and mountains. Another human-like monster, about which the Musqueam told stories, was the Khatsahlano, or Evil Seeker, which Suttles' informants identified as the cannibal ogress of Vancouver Island mythology. According to a Musqueam elder named James Point, the Sasquatch and the Khatsahlano were members of the same species, the former being male, and the latter being female. In 1963, 82-year-old Point told Suttles a traditional Musqueam story about the wild people, saying, "It must have been long ago, when there were still only Indians here, and everywhere upon the river, too, there were only Indians. There were none of those who were called white people, but only Indian people. According to the old people, walking in the woods, everywhere away from water, were what are called ulpadal. They were big, resembling a person, but tall, far taller than the biggest people here, and it is said that their wives are what the people called the Khatsahlano. It must have been that now deceased Khatsahlano, who was the one who came down to the shore when it became evening and was nearly dark, carrying on her back what was called an ulpadal, as a container for everything that she was getting on the ground, as she roamed all over the woods. These were all sorts of lizards, frogs, and snakes, just all sorts of things like that. They were inside the basket that she carried on her back when she was going around doing that. When it had become evening, or nearly dusk, she went from one to another of the houses at that time, sort of sneaking after the people, when the Indians had nearly gone to bed, and sometimes she would catch a small child who was still outside. She would quickly jump to grab it and put it into the basket that she carried. Suttles did not include the rest of Point's narrative, stating only that the ogress spoke, danced, and sang under the possession of an evil spirit, and was ultimately roasted to death in her own fire pit, in a repetition of other basket ogress stories common to native traditions across British Columbia. Interestingly, the Sasquatch and the Khatsahlano were not the only wild people which the Musqueam believed haunted the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. Later in his article, Suttles included a brief passage from the narration of Musqueam elder Andrew Charles, who, in 1960, described a strange event that occurred years later with 2 other men in the Gulf Islands, which abut Vancouver Island's eastern shore. While following a game trail through the forest, he and his fellow hunters heard a succession of peculiar noises in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a Douglas fir crashing to the forest floor. The natives attributed the noises to creatures called the Kwantlen, which Andrew's wife, Christine, translated as the Little Choppers. It is supposed to be an animal that has the habit of knocking down dead trees, Andrew explained. It has only 1 leg, and something in its hand to strike the dead trees with. You could hear it. It's gone out of existence. You don't see them anymore. South of traditional Musqueam territory, around the low-lying estuary of the south arm of the Fraser River, from Richmond to Point Roberts, lies the ancestral heartland of the Tsawwassen First Nation, whose name means land facing the sea. Like their northerly neighbors, these Coast Salish people also believed that a race of wild men dwelled in the forest beyond their villages. Scottish botanist Dr. Robert Brown, leader of the 1864 Vancouver Island exploring expedition, appears to have included some traditional Tsawwassen wildman stories in his 1873 book, The Races of Mankind. One of these appears to be a Tsawwassen variation of the basket ogress legend, so common among the indigenous traditions of British Columbia. Sasquatch, the evil women of the Fraser River Flats, Brown wrote. Once upon a time, a long time ago, 2 bad women lived on Fraser River. They are still remembered as the Sasquatch. They lived on young children and traveled about from village to village, picking up their victims and pitching them into a basket woven of water snakes, which they carried on their backs. Brown described how one of the evil women took her predations to a native village near Point Roberts. The men of this village routinely headed out to sea on fishing trips, and the women either occupied themselves hunting clams and berries or napped in the longhouse, leaving their children to play unattended on the beach. Sasquatch came along, Brown wrote, and snatching up the children one after another, pitched them into her snake basket. And before their cries could alarm the sleeping village on that sleepy summer afternoon, she had escaped into the woods with them, and lay concealed in its dark recesses until nightfall, when she lit a fire. The ogress proceeded to dig a pit and heat a quantity of stones. She intended to steam the children by placing them in the hole with the hot stones, pouring water over them, and covering the earthen oven with cedar bark mats. The children, having recovered from their fright, discerned the evil woman's intentions and resolved to escape their hideous fates. The ogress then ordered the children to shut their eyes and dance around her in a circle. The prisoners did as requested and began blindly capering around the monster. The littlest children, overwhelmed by fear and curiosity, frequently opened their eyes to see what the ogress was up to. When the hag perceived these infractions, she sealed the offending eyes with tree sap. The oldest children prudently kept their own peeking inconspicuous and infrequent, lulling the old monster into a sense of security, and sparing them from the handicaps imposed on their young companions. At one point, the ogress stooped down to tend to the fire. The older children seized the opportunity and pushed her into her own pit, holding her there until she was reduced to embers. But her evil spirit lived after her, Brown concluded, for out of her ashes, blown about by the wind, sprang the best of mosquitoes, which even now troubles mankind. East of Tsawwassen country, from present-day Surrey to Fort Langley, lies the historic homeland of the Kwantlen, another downriver Hokomalum nation with tales of wild women. Dr. Robert Brown included one of these stories in his aforementioned book, a sequel to the Tsawwassen legend of the Sasquatch. Following the death of her kinswoman, the other ogress to terrorize the natives of the Fraser Delta when searching for human victims on the shores of Mud Bay, at the southern end of present-day Surrey. While prowling along the beach, she spotted a pair of young fishermen spearing salmon from their canoe and called out to them, begging them to ferry her to her home. Too terrified to deny her, the boys acceded to her demand and paddled ashore. On the pretext of keeping their passenger dry, they prepared a tall seat from cedar branches which they piled to the gunwales. The ogress lay atop this bed, and the young men guided their craft out into the ocean. When they reached deep water, the fishermen jerked the canoe violently, pitching their unwanted passenger into the sea. The monster clawed desperately for the canoe, but was unable to reach it, and drowned in the waters of the Salish Sea. The Indian thinks that she yet lives at the bottom of the sea, Brown wrote, and devours drowned men. This story, in one form or another, is found among all the northern tribes, as far as the Queen Charlotte Islands or further. The botanist went on to explain how a certain Haida chief ordered one of his canoe mates to shoot him if it seemed inevitable that they would capsize, preferring the quick mercy of a musket ball to the appalling prospect of ingestion by the evil woman at the bottom of the sea. Later in his book, Brown included another Kwantlen tale set in a native village near present-day Fort Langley, at the easternmost edge of the greater Vancouver area. The story revolves around a widow who lived with her 3 sons. One day, her eldest son decided to go on a vision quest, praying, fasting, and frequently washing himself with cold water in a remote corner of the wilderness, in the hope of obtaining the guardianship of an inhuman spirit. He asked his mother for permission to attempt this dangerous operation, and despite her fierce protests, eventually received her blessing. So he went away and wandered through the woods, Brown wrote, until he came to a lonely lake surrounded by swampy marshes. There, the boy met a crane, who invited him to visit the home of his master on the other side of the lake. The boy acquiesced and allowed the bird to ferry him across the water. On the opposite shore stood a strange house, which the boy entered on the crane's encouragement. No sooner had he passed the threshold, however, than the door slammed shut behind him. The boy peered into the darkness of the hut. Before him, he could faintly make out a hulking, human-like form looming in the shadows. As his eyes became accustomed to the gloom, the vision quester realized, with a thrill of horror, that the figure was glaring at him, with a single eye set in the midst of its face. He had entered the home of Natsachen, or Kokwachem, a dreaded one-eyed giant. The Cyclops promptly killed the boy, tore out his heart, and placed it on a bench beside his body. Back in the village, the mother knew that something terrible had befallen her son, a sentiment which was verified when the boy failed to return home from his vision quest within the customary period. Her second eldest son resolved to find out what had become of his older brother, and received permission to do so from his reluctant, grieving mother. Like his ill-fated predecessor, he found the lake in the swamp, was taken by the crane to the home of the Cyclops, and had his heart removed and placed beside his body. Now the widow was very sorry at their not returning, Brown wrote, but still she could not oppose the wish of her last son when he wished to go after his 2 brothers. The same thing happened to him. He was ferried over the lake, and his heart taken out by the giant, and laid beside his body on the bench, where already his 2 brothers were. When her last son failed to return from his errand, the widow wept bitterly, until her tears soaked the earth. Despite her grief, the woman had the presence of mind to clean up her tears, lest some evil medicine man find them and use them to put a curse on her. Accordingly, she gathered some moss and wiped at the tear-soaked ground. Her eyes were very dim with weeping, Brown wrote, so that she could scarcely see, but as she looked down at the moss, she was astonished at seeing a little child lying where the moss was. So she took it up and laid it on her couch. Next day, he had grown up a big boy, and next day was a full-sized man. "Ah," said the people, "he is a great medicine man." This unexpected gift did not assuage the woman's grief, and she continued to weep for her lost sons. Seeing this, the medicine child, as Brown's informants called the mysterious creature, assured the widow that he would find her sons and bring them back. Donning a robe made of woodpecker skins, and arming himself with a sword made from elk horn, the medicine child set out into the forest on the trail of the 3 boys. Like the widow's sons, the medicine child found the swampy lake and accepted the crane's invitation to visit his master's home. When he reached the hut, however, he refused to go inside, insisting instead that the crane's master meet him in the open air. The giant agreed to this and made to exit his house. As he stooped in the doorway, the medicine child beheaded him with a single swing of his elk horn sword. He then entered the house, found the corpses of the three brothers, and returned their hearts to their chest, restoring them to life. The boys returned home, to the inexpressible joy of their mother. Reunited once again, the family lived happily in their village on the Fraser River, accepting the Medicine Son, as they called him, as one of their own. Over time, however, the family began to neglect the Medicine Son, making him despondent. One evening, when his mother forgot to call him for supper, the mystery boy sulkily curled up in his blanket and went to sleep. When the mother finally came to rouse him, she shook the blanket and discovered that the boy had disappeared, leaving in his place only the tuft of moss with the tears from whence he had sprung. Now they were all very sorry, Brown concluded, for they were no longer any better than other people. But he could not be recalled. The medicine youth had disappeared as strangely as he came. In the Strait of Georgia, just off the northeastern end of Vancouver's Stanley Park, stands a striking outcropping known as Siwash Rock. According to Squamish legend, the Squamish being a Central Coast Salish nation, endemic to northerly Howe Sound and the Squamish River, this unusual lithic formation is the petrified corpse of a man turned to stone in ancient times by demi-deities called Transformers. On June 14, 1939, a Vancouver pioneer named William Mackey told a story to Major James Skit Matthews, the city of Vancouver's first archivist, which hints at an old Squamish belief that Siwash Rock was once the abode of a wild man. This tale first appeared in Volume 5 of Matthews' periodical Early Vancouver, and was reprinted in the archivist's 1955 book, Conversations with Khatsahlano, 1932 to 1954. William Mackey claimed that his uncle and namesake worked as a lumberjack at northerly Moodyville, now North Vancouver, on the northern shores of the Burrard Inlet, cutting masts for sailing ships. One day, the elderly Mackey was obliged to pass by Siwash Rock in an Indian dugout canoe, accompanied by a young native boy. The boy fearfully urged the logger to steer clear of the landmark, telling him that it was home to slolacooms, or dangerous preternatural entities like wild men and two-headed serpents. Mackey paid no heed to the remonstrances, telling the boy that slolacooms did not bother white men like him. This did little to reassure the boy, who dove to the bottom of the vessel and covered himself with a blanket, shivering with fear. Moved by his companion's terror, Mackey called out to the rock in Chinook jargon, telling the unseen spirits to leave them alone, and that there were only white men in the canoe. The pair passed Siwash Rock unmolested. Several days later, back in Moodyville, the elder Mackey encountered his erstwhile canoe companion, who was accompanied by a native friend his age. The boy told his friend that the lumberjack had boldly defied the monster that haunted Siwash Rock, which he referred to as a big teeth, big hair in Chinook jargon. The city of Vancouver was born from the tangenta of the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush, a mad dash for the Lytton goldfields, which began in 1858 and spread to northerly Caribou Country in 1861. In order to serve the ever-growing throng of stampeders, which trickled in from California, New York, Eastern Canada, and the British Isles, farmers and manufacturers began to set up shop along the Fraser Delta. Although initially concentrated in New Westminster, the springboard from which prospectors launched their British Columbian enterprises, some of these auxiliary industrialists began to plant their roots along the northerly Burrard Inlet, a deep natural harbor more accommodating to steamships, on which low-grade coal had been discovered. One such pioneer was Captain Edward Stamp, an English master mariner and veteran of the Crimean War, who in 1867 established a sawmill that would come to be known as the Hastings Mill at the northeastern edge of what is now the district of Khatsahlano. That same year, another English steamboat captain named John Dayton, nicknamed Gassy Jack for his talkative nature, established the Globe Saloon nearby, providing a much-needed watering hole for thirsty sailors and mill workers. A small settlement sprang up around the public house, whose residents dubbed it Gastown in honor of the Globe Saloon's garrulous proprietor. The town was officially surveyed in 1870 and christened Granville after the United Kingdom's colonial secretary. Granville was selected as the terminus of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which would connect British Columbia with Canada's eastern provinces. It was renamed Vancouver in honor of the British Royal Navy officer who charted the Burrard Inlet during his 1792 exploration of the Pacific Northwest. On June 13, 1886, 1 year after the railway's completion, and a mere 2 months after Vancouver's incorporation as a city, a fire swept through the seaside settlement, destroying most of its wooden buildings. From the ashes of this great Vancouver fire, a modern city was built, which exploded in population throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, initiating its transformation into the metropolis it is today. As a general rule, historic wildman sightings typically occur in wilderness areas, far from the noise and activity of the big city. Despite this, Vancouver proper lays claim to a small handful of Sasquatch reports, which lie scattered throughout classic Bigfoot literature. The oldest of these is the story of Squamish chief August Jack Khatsahlano, a well-liked and respected figure who grew up during Vancouver's early days, from whom a considerable portion of Squamish ethnographic information derives. In a 1957 article for the Victoria Daily Times, journalist Larry Stanwood included a brief description of a story that Chief Khatsahlano told 26-year-old Renee de Hinden, a Swiss-Canadian Sasquatch researcher who was planning an expedition into the coast mountains in search of the legendary wild man. Sometime in the 1880s, the chief claimed, a 9-foot-tall female Sasquatch was captured and put on display in New Westminster, then the main settlement in the region, which lies in the Fraser Delta, just southeast of present-day Vancouver proper. The old chief says he saw the creature in New Westminster, where she was caged and exhibited for 10 cents a peek, the journalist declared. The captive, says the chief, was taken to Victoria for exhibition, but would not eat, and soon died. Despite some significant discrepancies, Khatsahlano's tale strongly evokes the story of Jacko, a juvenile wild man supposedly captured by Canadian Pacific Railway workers in the summer of 1884 near the mouth of the Fraser Canyon, which was allegedly held in the New Westminster jail before being shipped to Victoria. Unlike Khatsahlano's 9-foot-tall female Sasquatch, however, Jacko was said to be a male, standing 4'7". It must be mentioned that most researchers who have written on the Jacko story have dismissed it as a hoax perpetrated by mischievous British Columbian journalists, disregarding several eyewitness testimonies made by both natives and whites, which attest to the truth of the story. If Chief Khatsahlano's brief account is truly related to the Jacko story, then its New Westminster connection is merely incidental to the tale's primary setting at the mouth of the Fraser Canyon. One classic Sasquatch sighting, definitively set in Vancouver proper, is said to have occurred in around 1925 in Stanley Park, a 1,000-acre forested area which comprises the northwestern half of Vancouver's downtown peninsula. The story was related by Dorothy Bailey, a woman from Sydney, BC, on Vancouver Island, and published in the May 7, 1957 issue of Vancouver, BC's The Province. American cryptozoologist Chad Arment reproduced the account in his 2019 book, The Historical Bigfoot. Back in 1925 or 1926, Bailey told the press, my mother had taken my sister and I to the wonderful playground in Stanley Park. We were playing near the edge of the playground by the bushes when she let out a scream and grabbed me to run to mother. In her description, she had seen a gorilla-like man standing up, towering over the bushes. It was standing still, watching us play. To this day, I have often wondered if anyone else may have seen the same thing. With so much talk about the Sasquatch lately, it makes me wonder if that could have been a Sasquatch, and if they inhabited Stanley Park years ago, when it was a much denser forest than it is now. Just south of Vancouver proper, cradled by the north and south arms of the Fraser Delta, lies Lulu Island, home to the city of Richmond, British Columbia. Present-day Richmond is perhaps best known for boasting the highest concentration of ethnic Chinese per capita in all of Canada, its demographic makeup having earned it the epithet North America's most Asian city. Back in 1966, however, the so-called Garden City was a quaint municipality with a population of 50,000, whose populace had not yet been enlarged by the influx of Hong Kong immigrants who would pour into the greater Vancouver area in the 1980s and 90s. That summer, the rural outskirts of Richmond are said to have been visited by one of the Slalakum, whispered of in Tsawwassen campfire legend. The series of sightings which comprise this story were collected by Canadian Sasquatch researchers John Willison Green and Renee de Hinden, and detailed in several British Columbian newspapers. Green's coverage of the events is uncharacteristically inconsistent, conflicting with contemporary newspaper articles and deviating across his various writings. In his 1978 book, Sasquatch: The Apes Among Us, he mistakenly dated the sightings to 1969. According to Green in his 1973 book, The Sasquatch File, brothers Don and Bob Gilmore, who owned a farm on the number 8 road, which runs up the eastern end of Lulu Island, noticed that something in a pine bog adjoining a distant field was scaring their cattle, so that they would stampede up towards the barn. The brothers found this odd, as their cattle had spent their lives on the open range, and had never previously retreated to the farmyard on account of wild animals. On July 15th, while shingling the farmhouse roof with his hired hand, Hank Porst, Don heard the familiar rumble of beating hooves and stood up to investigate. To his astonishment, he found that his cattle were being chased by a dark, hairy animal. According to an article in the July 23, 1966 issue of the Vancouver Sun, the farmer claimed that the animal went on all fours like a bear. The next day, Bob discovered that a section of barbed wire fence, which ran through the aforementioned pine bog about half a mile from the farmhouse, had been ripped 2 feet out of the ground and tossed aside. While mending the fence, neither he or Don heard the telltale roll of stampeding cattle and stepped out into the open to see what was causing the commotion. The farmer saw a hairy black figure chasing the cows on all twos, as Green recorded it. About a week later, on July 21st, 1966, a 35-year-old English-Canadian artist named John Osborne, while sitting on an embankment on either the number 5 or number 3 road, closer to town, sketching the landscape, spotted a brown, slim, 7-foot, hair-covered man-like creature standing in a patch of brush. It wasn't ape-like, he told a reporter for the Vancouver Sun. It was like a big, hairy man, about 6 feet 8 to 7 feet tall. The artist, who had never heard the legend of the Sasquatch, proceeded to sketch the creature, which he observed for about 15 seconds from a distance of about 75 feet, before it walked back into the bush. His drawing was published in the July 22, 1966 issue of the Vancouver Sun. Later that same night, a woman named Darlene Leaf, who was babysitting at her neighbor's house at Westerly No. 2 Road, which now cuts through the heart of Richmond, heard the horses making a great fuss in the barn about 10 p.m. Although the babysitter neglected to investigate the excitement, she encountered what she assumed was the source of it several hours later, after her charge's parents had returned home. While walking back to her own residence, she spotted the head and shoulders of a man-like figure looming from behind a row of 7-foot-tall raspberry bushes. The following morning, a Richmond store owner named John McKernan was driving along the banks of the Fraser River, perhaps on what is now River Road, when he saw a hairy giant stride on 2 legs across a perpendicular dirt road, apparently heading in the direction of a farm. It came out from behind a tree and disappeared in some bushes, Green wrote, beside a large drainage ditch. Green and DeHinden, who were in the Richmond area investigating the reports of Leaf, Osborne, and the Gilmore brothers, interviewed McKernan that day and examined the scene of his sighting. Although they failed to locate any tracks, they found evidence of something large having bedded down in some nearby bushes. Green included his own analysis of the July 1966 Richmond sightings in Sasquatch: The Apes Among Us, writing, "The report suggests that the thing had probably crossed to the north side of the river, onto the island from a large bog on the south shore, where a fair variety of wildlife is still reported to live, although it certainly wouldn't harbor a Sasquatch population. It had apparently hung around in a similar bog near the farm for a few days, then gone exploring farther west, finally heading back to where it had come from." Unbeknownst to Green and DeHinden at the time, July 1966 bore witness to another Sasquatch sighting in the nearby city of White Rock, located a short distance to the southeast, just south of Surrey. DeHinden learned of the event 3 years later and related to Green, who published a brief description of it in the Sasquatch File. According to Green, a man named Latoul, who lived in a small house built against a steep bank on the outskirts of White Rock, claimed that an enormous man, covered with light hair, walked up the long trail to his home one moonlit night. The creature loitered about the house for some time, before climbing up a ladder onto the roof, and proceeding up the hill against which the house was built. Latoul reported the incident to the RCMP, who conducted a fruitless investigation of his property. Green claimed that by the time he got around to investigating the sighting, the RCMP report, which included a sketch of the creature that Latoul had witnessed, had been destroyed.